Hi, everyone. Welcome to my podcast. This is Heena Lotus. As you guys know, I have been on a multitude of different platforms and networks. I have decided to launch my own podcast, especially because we have a very special guest tonight. It's someone that, I have been working with for the past few days, really getting to know his story and understanding where he came from, due to a multitude of very sensitive topics, I guess you could say, and things that he went through. I decided that it would make more sense if I had my own platform to interview him so we wouldn't have to go through any red tape or anything of that nature. I'm so humbled to have him on. His name is Adam. He was a previous police officer. He's of Palestinian, background and Muslim descent. I'm so honored and humbled to have him on. Adam, I would love for you to be able to introduce yourself. Please tell everyone about your background, your family, your friends, your occupation, your education, hobbies, interests. Our audience would love to get to know you.
Of course. So, hey, I'm Adam Awwad. I'm a Palestinian American. I was born in Beirut, Lebanon, but my family, they're originally from Tulkarem, Palestine. But I was raised in Birmingham, Alabama all my life, and I'm one of six. I have six brothers, and that's including myself. And, throughout my life, I grew up in a Muslim community in Birmingham, Alabama. And I've always just kind of been around the Muslim community. I will say, sheltered in a way. And it wasn't until I started to get into law enforcement and really look into it. And it was more so getting more into law. I was really interested in law and how it works. And I was really looking at the bigger objective of becoming a lawyer. But I guess my objective changed over time as I started looking at law enforcement, and over time I started watching a lot of documentaries, and getting really more in depth with how police officers work, how the structure works, and that's what motivated me to essentially go into law enforcement.
No, I love that. And this is a question that I'm sure you get asked often, that you will always be asked very often. Right now, when it comes to the police force, they're at odds with the Muslim community, with the Arab community, with minority communities. It seems to just be a very big stigma in this day and age, especially for people from, our specific background. Granted all those stigmas, what inspired you to become a police officer?
So that's a great question. So growing up as a Palestinian Muslim in America, I saw how firsthand our community was really misunderstood. And not even just the Palestinian community, but the Muslim community, especially when it comes to law enforcement. So what I wanted to do was kind of bridge that gap. I wanted to build a bridge between the Muslim community, whether it's in law enforcement, whether it's, working for the federal government or working for any type of branch of government, there's always this stigma. There's always a view that people have of Muslims. And what I wanted to do was change that narrative. I wanted to show people, look, I am a Muslim. I do follow the Islamic faith. However, I am a police officer just like you. I'm serving and protecting the community, and I want to do that. I want to enforce the law, but I also want to be there for the Muslim community. I want to be the spokesperson, kind of build that bridge that's needed and it's necessary. And I've said this before, and I've always will stand by this. There needs to be Muslims in law enforcement. There needs to be Muslims in government, whether it's lawyers, judicial government. I mean, it doesn't matter what it can be. Muslims are needed, and it is very important because you could have somebody represent you. You could have somebody speak on your behalf. But when you have somebody that's understands the culture, that understands that gap, they could really speak out more in depth and can kind of emphasize more on what it is to be a Muslim in America. So I think that was very necessary, and that's one of the main reasons why I joined law enforcement.
I think that answer is so important and so pivotal because I think that a lot of people are coming to the conclusion that we have to be anti-system, anti-government, X, Y, and Z because it's not in line with like our religion or culture or identity. But I think at the end of the day, representation does definitely matter. And so if we do have more individuals from like a Muslim background, a Palestinian background, an Arab background, minority background as a whole represented in certain parts of government and the police force, I think that it does kind of symbolically show that we are trying to work with the culture, not against the culture, and that our representation will be beneficial not just for, the domestic community at large, but for like the collective ummah. So I'm glad that you were able to kind of explain that perspective, especially granted all the stigma and, red tape around it. And, kind of getting into the next question, granted the fact that you are coming from a Palestinian background, you are a Muslim. Obviously, we both know what's going on in Palestine right now and the conflict that's been ongoing. How has this entire, I guess, political culture really impacted you on a personal level?
Absolutely. So, being a Palestinian, it teaches you resilience. You grow up understanding loss, patience, the importance of truth. Watching what's happening right now in Palestine, in Gaza, the genocide, the suffering, it truly is heartbreaking, but it also gives me strength. It reminds me why I cannot stay silent when I see injustice. No matter where it happens, stand up for what's right, stand up for what you believe in. And not only that, I've said this before, there has to be that bridge. There has to be a way for Muslims to be understood through the general public. And that's one of the main reasons that, I ask many Muslim police officers, I ask many Muslims who are not police officers, they should get in law, they should look at it. And especially with a Palestinian background, I mean, that is very essential.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, that kind of takes me to the next question that I have for you. When did your journey in law enforcement begin? And coming into it as like a Muslim, is there like what separated you from the herd, I guess you could say? And did you notice any sort of like cultural differences between you and, the members that you were working with per se?
Yes. So, I started my law enforcement journey with a city police department in Mobile, Alabama. So, I mean, walking into that environment as a Muslim, it wasn't easy. It was a, culture built on toughness, hierarchy, tradition, and at times, people didn't understand my background and faith. But what I did was I always represented my faith. I stayed true to myself. I fasted, I prayed. I did the things that every normal Muslim, normal everyday Muslim does. And I kept showing respect and professionalism. And over
And
time,
not to interrupt you, would you say that like religion for you is like a big part of who you are? Like is it a pillar of like your identity?
absolutely, absolutely. It's who we are as Muslims. But even in law enforcement, you see things that no one should ever see. And you have to live by those things that you see. You have to go home every single day after an 8 hour shift, 12 hour shift, after you've seen the most horrific things imaginable. So I think a good personal relationship with God is essential. It is very much needed. Whether Muslim, Christian, it doesn't matter what the faith is. That relationship you have with God, I think it's extremely important and it's very necessary.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think for me, like going from the corporate world into journalism, a big part of that was Islam for me because I realized, kind of like you, there's a lot of misrepresentation of how Muslims are, being perceived in the media. So I kind of realized, very similar to you actually, that if I want the narrative about Muslims to change, I, as a Muslim woman, have to enter, the podcasting world and the world of journalism and news and media, because if we are not as Muslims advocating for ourselves, who really will, right? So I'm really really glad that you were able to think along those lines and bring a piece of that to your occupation as well. Now, from my understanding, that was the law enforcement agency that you started out with, but you transitioned into a completely different agency per se. What inspired and motivated you to do that?
Yeah, so I worked for different municipalities. I've never had issues with those municipalities. I did my job, I did my work, and eventually I worked for a university police department, and that was the first university police department I've ever worked for. The move was really about growth and purpose. I wanted to serve in a community that reflected diversity. A place where I could essentially help bridge gaps between culture, advocate for students, and especially Muslim students who oftentimes feel unseen and currently still do feel unseen. So, education was a big factor, but the reason why I wanted to go to this specific university, it's one of the biggest in the southeast region of the United States. It's a huge university in Alabama, and this university has a huge diversity population, huge. People from all different walks of life, cultures, religions. In municipal policing, you encounter, Muslims or, immigrant communities occasionally. But like a campus like this, where you have an agency on campus um, that deals and is surrounded by diversity every single day. I met people who serve the same faith as me, same cultures, same values. And it wasn't occasionally like it was in a municipality. It was on an everyday basis. So I think it was very important and essential that I joined. I wanted to be that officer that could be there for the general public, but not just for the general public, for the Muslim students, for the minorities, for the people that need their voice spoken out, who need representation, who somebody else from a different culture might not understand. And I could understand very much so. So that's why it was very essential for me to join. And I really just wanted to be that person to help and assist.
I think that's incredible. So you were trying to advocate for people who looked like you, understood life through, a very similar lens, who came from a similar religious background, cultural background, or maybe it was just a minority that wasn't part of the norm. And so your advocacy had more to do with protecting the community you came from as opposed to, how we hear a lot like selling out or anything of that nature. Would you agree
Correct.
with that statement?
Correct. I 100% agree. And like I said, I tell people that a lot of cultures, a lot of diversities. I mean, a lot of what I dealt with in the university was things that are just not taught in law enforcement. You're taught in law enforcement to enforce the law. You're taught to serve the public. You're taught to be a safeguard for property and lives. But where does the cultural understanding come from? Where is the training for diversity? How do you deal with somebody that comes from a different culture, different understanding, completely different way, of life? And that's why it was essential for somebody like me to put their foot in there, kind of say, like, look, guys, you might not have had training in this, but I can be that person to help you with this. And I think that's very necessary and it was very important for me to be there.
Yeah, I agree. We're often taught that we need to be an ambassador of our faith, and that includes in areas where we might not necessarily be understood or welcome. So I think, in a way, a lot of people do, and I hate to say this, but a lot of people view Muslims or minorities who go into the police force or military or things of that nature, and they say, well, these people are complete, sellouts, and they're trying to sell out their community X, Y, and Z. But there are a multitude of individuals who are trying to advocate for their communities and be represented in areas and regions where we may not have a voice and where we are marginalized. So I think you kind of took it from a very different perspective and angle, and I think a lot of people, hopefully the audience watching this will understand that through your lens. That being said, I do want to kind of get into the heart of this interview per se. As we both know, October 7th is a very hypersensitive date. It changed a multitude of lives. It changed people's lives, of course abroad, but even on a domestic level. Before we get into the aftermath of October 7th, can you tell me what your experience was as a police officer working in the force prior to October 7th?
Yes. So before that time, I had really built like a strong reputation. I worked at, like I said, at different several agencies. And honestly, I never experienced any kind of, direct hate or serious discrimination. I mean, sure, from time to time, I would hear jokes, about my ethnicity or my culture, but it wasn't with malice or hate, and most of the time it was just a misunderstanding. And it was, I would say, ignorance and misunderstanding at the same time. But that's why it was necessary for me to be there, so I can teach them and explain to them, how they perceive the wrong notion of Islam and my faith and my culture. So even at the university before October 7th, I was treated with respect. I got along with everybody, supervisors, officers. I was really proud of what I did. I built relationships. I met a lot of people, and I really was a person, of ethnic origin that anybody can come and talk to. I had all kinds of different walks of life come and speak to me, and it was very, it just felt amazing to know that I am that person. I am representing so many different communities, and that were often, Muslim, non-Muslim. It was just an awesome feeling, and it really wasn't until after I started to see the things started to kind of shift, and I truly believe it wasn't based off of my work ethic. The administration really sought my work ethic to be outstanding and exceptional. It was just who I am, you know, who Adam Awwad is, what his religion is. I think, and I truly believe those factors came into play.
Well, let's kind of, follow up on that. So October 7th happens, it changes a multitude of people's lives, including yours. Where do you think, or how do you think the shift started after October 7th and how you were treated, viewed? Was there any form of discrimination? Did attitudes change? I kind of wanted to hone in on that because I think that's, extremely important. And the reason I ask you that is I think there's a multitude of people, not just in the police force, but people working at jobs that are very heavily aligned, I guess you could say, with Israel or APAC or discrimination against Muslims. So I think, hearing your experience and what you went through October 7th would resonate with a multitude of people, not just, police officers that are Muslim, but a multitude of Muslims and people who advocate for human rights and, our current climate.
Absolutely. And I agree. I mean, so for me, it really wasn't until after October 7th. And that's when I began to notice a shift. So, like, at first, it was subtle, a few looks, quiet comments, being left out of conversations. But over time, it started to become more clear and more obvious. Conversations about Palestine or Muslims or Palestinian Muslim students. I mean, it really made people uneasy. And it felt like my identity, something that I've always been proud of, was kind of being seen differently. So really, what I experienced was, and it was really shocking because I never thought that I would ever experience something like this in my entire life. But right after October 7th, I think it was shortly after, the Muslim students in my university, they obtained permission from the university, from the police department, to conduct a protest. And the administration decided to let the officers know that, they wanted heavy presence. They wanted to make sure no, outbursts were going to happen, no conflicts, no physical confrontation. They were very adamant on safety. And
Can I
that's what I
ask you a
took.
question really quick? Not to interrupt
Yes.
you. Was this presence also requested or expected at, let's say, like pro-Israel events, or was this strictly for the pro-Palestine side?
So, to my knowledge, from what I understood, was that this was just for the Palestinian students.
Okay.
The not just the Palestinian students, for Muslim students who were advocating for Palestine. So what happened was I got approached by a sergeant and a detective. They both approached me and they asked me to be involved in this protest. The detective wanted me to wear what he called a turban. But we know it as Muslims, we know it as Arabs. It's not a turban, it's a kufiya. I mean, it's the one that's behind me right now and the one that's behind your chair. They asked me to wear a kufiya and to essentially take pictures and videos of anybody that was holding a uh, free Palestine flag and holding a protest and holding a sign that said Free Palestine.
So it
But
wasn't even about
overall,
them looking suspicious or being violent or potentially having like a weapon or anything. It was strictly just the fact that they had either the kufiya or the flag. That's was that like the common denominator essentially?
correct. So they obtained permission. They obtained permission from the university police department, and they obtained permission from the administration, the university's administration. So there was no criminal intent. They had done nothing criminal. There was no criminal matter. There was no investigation. But they came to me and they asked me to be involved in this protest and wanted me there simply for the fact that they said, and this is from the individual's own mouth who approached me, was that I looked Arab and I knew some of these people and I would be a good fit to be involved in this protest. So I questioned it, I stood against it, and I said, no, I'm not going to agree to this. I'm not going to do this. This is wrong. And this is against everything I believe in. And this is not just everything I believe in, it's against my religion as well. And overall, they came back to me and they told me, well, we just want to make sure, and these were the words they used, nobody sets off any explosives, nobody sets off any kind of riot or any kind of physical confrontation. We just want to be sure that the individuals there are safe and both parties are safe. So I took offense to that. I really took offense to that. And I stood my ground and I denied to be involved. I denied to even be present during that time. I wanted to do nothing with the whole aspect of we want you to do counter surveillance against Muslim students who are advocating for peace. And at the end of the day, they were just explaining what was going on in Palestine. They were giving the individuals who are not aware of the situation, because a lot of the students weren't aware of what's really going on in Palestine. They hear about it, what's going on in the news, and they hear what's going on, Fox News, CNN, and they only get one biased side. They don't get the actual side of truly what's going on. So when they asked me to do that, I felt uncomfortable. I felt uneasy about it. And that's, I think, the what I believe when the notion of where the racism, discrimination over the period of time started to come into effect and eventually make its way into my career.
So essentially, what you're saying is you were asked to go undercover, spy on your own community when they, you yourself recognize they weren't doing anything intrinsically wrong, but were trying to bring a fair perspective to the conflict. And I don't even like calling it a conflict, the genocide. Um, and then because you refused to do that, it kind of served as the catalyst for everything that came afterwards. And that's when you really started feeling discriminated against on a multitude of different levels. Is that correct?
Correct. So what I started realizing was another officer would commit a policy violation or he would commit a serious violation or a serious offense. And the department would kind of look at that officer, look at what he committed, and really thoroughly look into it. And after that incident, they kind of would just give a slap on the wrist. Hey, don't do it again. They would have a talk. But with me, it was any little thing that occurred with me, even if it was the smallest complaint. We're humans. We're not perfect. We make mistakes. But it could be something as of I didn't smile at somebody. Somebody walked by and he smiled at me and waved, and I didn't smile and wave, and he decided to go call the police department and file a complaint. It was taken out of proportion. It was completely heavily looked into. It was also, I saw a pattern of me being micromanaged. I was being watched, analyzed. It kind of made me feel like I was walking on eggshells. I mean, it made my job there very difficult. And I truly believe this discrimination started after October 7th, because prior to October 7th, I was never really in any kind of issues with my administration. I didn't see any kind of problems per se. You had your little issues here and there, but it wasn't until after October 7th that everything kind of started to be looked at more and more. And I started to be really treated unfairly. And it just got worse and worse over time.
I think that's so unfortunate. I mean, we all kind of know what it's like to work in like the corporate world, and I think to be walking on eggshells and have, people discriminating against you or building a case against you is obviously a terrible thing. There's a multitude of people who've been through it, right? But I think for you to go through it because you decided to essentially stand on business, right? Advocate for your community, stand up for what, you thought was right at the time, and to be discriminated against, solely based on the decision to not sell out your own community, based on the fact that you are a Muslim American, based on the fact that you are an Arab, you are like, a Palestinian, is, I mean, it's disgusting, right? That's one way to put it. But I think in a lot of
Right.
ways, you could have, you could have gone back and been like, you know what? I'm just gonna, it's fine. I want to save my job. I'm gonna go ahead and sell out. I'll go ahead and agree to whatever they want. Do you think that what you did is something that aligns with your morals and values and principles? Is that like I guess what I'm trying to ask is the reason that you stood on your, decision, no matter how you were treated, was it based on your Islamic values?
Yes, absolutely. You know, I'm a Muslim. At the end of the day, I have someone to answer to. Regardless of what the law states, regardless of where I am, where I decide to work, where I decide to be, at the end of the day, I have my creator. I answer to God. If I was to do this, it would not just stand against my moral beliefs and my values. These are things that were embedded to me by my grandmother, by my mother. These were things that were taught to me throughout my life, not only just by my family, by the community that I attended, the community that was there for me, the Muslims that have been there for me, and at the end of the day, it was against my religion. It was against my religion. And, they were very adamant and very persuasive in getting me to try to be the guy that's there and I think they came to me because they saw me not just as an Arab Muslim. I think they also saw me as somebody who may know these people. So if any kind of inclination of a physical
Like
confrontation or
like
a
in
problem.
you might have insider information, kind of like that.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I found that very disturbing, very disrespectful. But yet again, and this is why I say it's very important for Muslims to be in law enforcement, to be in law, to be in the government. Because imagine if I was not there and I wasn't present to hear that kind of, information being passed down. Who knows what would have happened? And I think when I stood my ground and I refused to cooperate or be fully intact with it, I think that's when number one, I was looked at differently, but number two, I think that's when it gave the administration, and not just the administration, it gave the sense of law enforcement officers like, look, we need to look at this from different angles. We need to look at this from another way. He's an officer. He's been working in law enforcement for years, and yet he doesn't want to do this. So there may be a different way we're looking at this, maybe a wrong way. I think it opened a lot of eyes when I stood my ground and I stood to not agree with what they wanted me to do.
No, I think that's phenomenal. And you actually bring up a great point. I didn't even think about it from that perspective. You're right. Had you not been working, at that exact, day and time and been presented with that, I don't want to call it an offer, but essentially,
Right.
that situation and the fact that you declined and now you're able to talk about it with me and other individuals and say, hey, look, this is what's going on. We can only come to the conclusion that if you experience that, this has to be going on in different, police departments all over the country. This has to be going on some level, like at different universities. And we've seen that, right? We've seen so many protesters who are very peaceful on various different college campuses being arrested for essentially like, practicing their constitutional rights, and they're not being violent, they're not hurting anyone. They're doing something that is, it's part of American freedom, is it not? So I think it's very interesting that you bring up that perspective. Had you not been part of the police force, we would not be privy to that information. And, this actually brings me to my next question. Do you think that, and this can be applied to before October 7th, after October 7th, do you think that there were like cultural and religious differences? Well, obviously there are cultural and, religious differences, but based on those differences, do you think that, certain things, your morals, your values, your actions, the way that you went about things, do you think that there was maybe like some sort of like dissonance or disconnect between what your intentions were and how it was perceived by the police department as a byproduct of being raised Muslim and coming from a Palestinian background?
Absolutely. I think there were moments when my culture and my faith were misunderstood. In Islam, we're taught about humility, kindness, patience. And sometimes that can be mistaken for weakness or, what's considered lack of authority. And to explain, I mean, my actions were rooted in respect, moral principle. But I do believe like some of those values, which, come from my faith and heritage, were misinterpreted through a biased lens. And that misunderstanding unfortunately cost me dearly. So in Islam, we're taught that every act of kindness is a form of worship. Smiling at someone, offering help, showing warmth, these are all considered good deeds, things that bring blessings, and Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he taught us that even smiling is charity. So for me it was sort of being kind and friendly and approachable. It wasn't just who I am, it's my faith. But I noticed that over time, these actions were, even though I saw them as a positive motion, it was shown to my administration, it was shown to individuals who are non Muslim that, I was either too casual, unprofessional. And, when I was showing compassion, it was labeled as sometimes dismissive or immaturity. And it
So
was painful because
you were kind of being, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say, so you're essentially being misinterpreted, where your niyat, right? Your intentions were
absolutely,
one thing,
absolutely.
but they were being interpreted as something completely different. And that's actually it's almost like commentary on American and Western culture, is it not? Because it makes you realize that being friendly, being kind, having good intentions, wanting good for others, having good morals and values, it's such a foreign concept to the Western world that when they see people embodying those characteristics, trying to do good deeds, they're like, whoa, 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 this is creepy. Like we got to write them up for that, right? Like that's like it's so odd,
Absolutely,
but
absolutely.
that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, it was painful because my intentions were always sincere. In my culture, in my faith, you treat people the way you want to be treated. And that comes down to what you said, like your niyyah. Um,
And that's bigger than Islam. That's just the golden rule. So
absolutely, absolutely. And I wasn't being immature. I was really just being a human. I was being a Muslim who believes in doing something good, smiling, helping others. I mean, that's the essence of who we should be. No matter what uniform you wear, that's who you should be as a human being. And I think, unfortunately, my administration completely just misinterpreted that, and it really, like I said, it costed me dearly.
this, not to make it about myself by any means, but this reminds me of something so interesting. So I grew up in Texas. I now live in Florida. I've lived in a multitude of different states, but I'm a Southern girl growing up in Texas. And they always say Texas is a very like friendly state. So everyone's smiling at strangers and waving and helping out and things like that. And I kind of grew up in that small town environment. So the first state that I moved to after Texas was in New York. And obviously, I'm sitting in the subway just smiling and waving and, just being my Texan, self. And people were like, my friends were like, you can't do that in New York. Like, people are going to think you're like out
Right,
to murder someone.
right.
They're going to think you're trying to like, like kidnap someone or something. And I just didn't understand it. But I'm like, I'm just smiling. But isn't that interesting that culturally speaking, being kind and polite and smiling and being friendly, right? Which is a Muslim value. But even bigger than that, it's a quality that good human beings should have, right? Is just such a foreign concept to so many different environments. It's interesting. So I completely understand where you're coming from. And this kind of brings me to my next question. Obviously, your intentions were being misinterpreted. Are you able to tell me exactly, from the time you're asked to do surveillance on your own community with the protests up until, the termination, what was kind of like the chronological order, like the series of events that led to that?
So a multitude of events happened after that, and unfortunately, some were so small that they didn't even need attention, were completely blown out of proportion. And like I said, I'm human. I make mistakes. We all make mistakes. But a lot of it was cultural misunderstanding. One thing would happen here, one thing would happen there, and my administration would look into it and then just paint this picture into this biggest problem ever, considering me a liability or considering me an issue. And
And
it
you had said
really,
other officers were doing the same things, but they were not being put under the microscope.
yes, and they oftentimes were doing even worse than that, and they were not put under the same microscope. So I started to see a pattern. It was a very unique pattern. The day of the day of the protest, you know, when they asked me to attend the protest and to be there and to wear the kufiya, and I said no, I kind of sensed how I would say, a sense of hostility per se. And, they didn't ask me to take pictures or videos of any of the students that day. It was over a multitude, of days or as you would say, weeks into after the protest. They were basically trying to say if there's anybody on the campus, anybody in the university carrying a Palestinian flag, holding a Free Palestine sign, let us know. And when I would speak up against this and say, hey guys, this is wrong, that's when I would sense more and more hostility. And I think that kind of grew. And that's what essentially I believe led to my recent incident where it unfortunately led to my termination. So if going back to my incident that led to my termination, what really happened was, I was genuinely trying to be nice. I genuinely believed it was misunderstood and mishandled. It began simply with me trying to help a fellow officer, a female coworker of mine. She's a supervisor, and I've known her for years. She's considered me as a younger brother figure, and that's always how she kind of looked at me. And she has a lot of respect and love for me, and I respect her, and I look up to her. She's somebody that I look up to, even till this day after this incident. Um, so what came from that was I was trying to do an act of kindness, and I was trying to show my respect to her. And my intention was never unprofessional. In fact, I was really trying to lighten the moment and show the care that I always have. But that interaction was completely taken the wrong way, and it escalated into something far beyond than what it should have ever been. So, like, it was around 2 weeks later after that incident, when I encountered that female supervisor. It was after that incident. I was brought into the police department. I wasn't given an explanation of what's going on. I was told I was being placed under investigation. I was told I was placed under administrative leave. And essentially they came, they took my gun, they took my badge. I was humiliated, and they escorted me off the property, and I left home that day and I was really upset. I was in tears. I was really hurt because I've never been placed under administrative leave. I've never been in any kind of sort of trouble that would dictate me to be fired or be placed in any kind of capacity where I would be suspended or looked at or investigated um to this extent. So, I knew my intentions were good. I knew I had done nothing wrong. So the next day I retained a lawyer. I spoke with my lawyer. I told him what
And this
happened. I
was
told him
this after termination?
no. So what had happened was they put me under administrative leave. I went home. The next day, I retained a lawyer. I had told my lawyer about what occurred. Now, when you're under administrative leave, it's kind of like you're suspended.
Right.
We're going to let you know what's going to happen. We're going to let you know when you can come back to work, or we're going to let you know when you're not going to come back to work. That's essentially what administrative leave is. And, every officer that's been placed under administrative leave can attest to that feeling of what it means to be put under administrative leave. Because
That's a lot of anxiety because you don't
it is a
know what's
lot of
going to happen. Yeah.
it is a lot of anxiety. It is a lot of you don't know if you're going to get your next paycheck. I mean, it's a lot of stress. So I was deeply hurt by it. So I had a small amount of money, and I retained a lawyer. I told my lawyer what happened, and when I presented him about the situation that I kind of was a little aware of because yes, they didn't tell me what was going on, but they kind of were beating around the bush to tell me why I was being investigated. But they really didn't present me with the facts. So I kind of was aware of, okay, I'm here because of that situation, but that situation was nothing. So why am I here? It was a little confusing. So I presented to my lawyer. My lawyer looked at it and he was baffled. He was shocked. He said, I can't believe they would put you on administrative leave for this. And we couldn't believe it either. So, over time, I obtained evidence. I went and I took exams, polygraph exams. I presented them with evidence that I did not do whatever was alleged against me. And I showed them the truth.
And you did this out of your own pocket. Like you're the one who took the initiative to do this. It wasn't
Yes,
the
yes.
administration asking you.
I went to somebody that the university has used before, somebody that conducts polygraph exams, and she has been doing that for years for the university. So I went to her and I paid out of pocket. I paid roughly $800 and I took two exams, and it was expensive. Um, so I presented the exams to my administration. My lawyer did. The administration looked over it, and after a month or so being placed under administrative leave, they didn't even have the courtesy to call me. They didn't even have the courtesy to contact me, not even send me a message. I was informed that I was terminated. I didn't have a hearing. I didn't have any kind of trial.
And is that
I go
part
to
of the process? Like before someone gets terminated, they are allowed to, I guess, like have counterpoints or have a trial or hearing or anything of that nature?
So I do believe it is a part of the process. I'm not really too sure how the process goes with this specific department, but I do believe it is somewhat in that capacity. So I just know that I wasn't given a trial, I wasn't given a hearing. And I found out from a letter in my mailbox in description, I was terminated. I was fired. Again, they didn't even have the courtesy to give me a call or talk to me in person. And that was really hurtful. I spent 3.5 years of my life serving this police department. I worked hard. I worked every single day, almost every single day. I worked a lot of overtime and I put my tears, my sweat into this job. And I took pride of this job. And what they did to me was extremely hurtful. And I'm really saddened and I'm really hurt by their decision. And unfortunately, you know, I went through their appeal process and I wasn't given much from the appeal process. I wasn't given a clear answer of what that's going to go, how that's going to go, or where that's going to go. So currently, I'm still seeking legal counsel. I'm still in this legal battle. It's just an unfortunate thing because right now I'm without a job, and when you're not without a job, your finances are tight. And unfortunately, I'm doing what I can to stay afloat, but it's been very, very difficult on me.
You know, the next question I was going to actually ask you was, what has your journey been like since, you've been let go? What have you been doing since then and how has this impacted you? But before we kind of get into you answering that question, I really have to commend you because I think that there were a multitude of moments where you could have been like, you know what, like this is going to affect my livelihood. I am so attached to, this job or, this is so comfortable. Why would I sit there and rebel? And you could have sold out and just been like, you know what? I'll do what they want me to. I will go ahead and do the surveillance. I'll do X, Y, and Z. And you stood your ground. And as a byproduct, you did end up losing your job. And I think I can't imagine how heartbreaking it must be to be in your shoes, but to know that you held your morals, your values, you stood by your guns, literally and figuratively speaking in this case, and you were able to do it on principle. I think a lot of people don't understand or realize this, but when you do things for a higher purpose than, let's say, money or fame or livelihood or, reputation, social media, things like that, it will always come back to you in some form. And so, inshallah, I hope that the decisions that you made, standing on, ground and doing the things that you did, the sacrifices that you've made, I know you're going through an immense amount of things right now and a lot of battles that you're not even able to discuss, in the short little podcast episode that we have.
Right.
But whatever good you do in life, when you make these sorts of sacrifices, it always comes back to you in some form. So I want you to first and foremost remember that. And there's a lot of people that are watching this right now who are going to be inspired by your words and compelled by your words. And you never know what kind of impact you have in society. And that's why it's important to get your story out there and for people to understand your perspective and not write you off and, kind of understand like the information, the knowledge, the experience that you're coming with. And, that all being said, what has happened? So you were terminated, you got that letter, you did seek legal counsel. What has your journey been like from that moment on to now? How's that changed you? And what are you and your family going through?
So it's really emotional because and I try, I really am staying strong in this because I do have my faith in Allah, and I do have my faith in my Creator God, that He is looking over me, He is looking after me. Um, it's been incredibly hard. Losing your livelihood is one thing, but I really believe I lost my identity, my sense of purpose. And I am the main caretaker of my family. My grandmother, she's sick, and I really am the one that takes care of her. Every day I would leave work, I would go to her, and after I left my job, I would attend to her care and attend to her needs. And that is the duty that everybody should have upon the family. But now it's even more difficult for me because I'm over here, and let's just say she needs any kind of medicine or any kind of medication, or anything of that nature. I'm over here without job and struggling with finances, so it's been very difficult. I'm having to rebuild everything from the ground up. It's been very emotional, and it's really taken a toll on me. But I'm trusting the process. I'm trusting in my Creator. I trust that God will protect me. God will look out for me. You know, it's not only affected me, it's affected my community. The community that I attend, the community that I serve, a lot of them put their trust in me because their children go to the university. And when they heard the news of me being terminated, and you know, me being discriminated against, and all these factors, they were really deeply hurt. It's opened eyes, and I think it's very important that the story be shared, because there are people out there that they are probably afraid to speak, probably afraid to say one word. And my story can really have a huge impact. So I just say to those who are listening, if you stand for what's right, it could cost nothing or it could cost everything. But just know, trust in the process, trust in your God, trust in the Creator. Everything will come out the way that it's supposed to be. And that's really where I leave it to.
No, I fully agree with you. And, as they say, since we are both do come from a Muslim background, he is the best of planners. So we
Of
have to put
course, of
everything
course.
in his hands. I agree with you. You already sort of answered this, but I really wanted to hone in on it because I know this has been a very life-changing experience, a very eye-opening experience for you. Looking back on everything you've experienced from day one up until now, the discrimination, the personal toll it's taken, the challenges that you faced, what is the biggest learning lesson for you? And this could be something personal or even just a message for the audience, however you want to answer it.
So one thing I'll say is empathy, and that is a strong, strong word to stand on. I learned understanding how people from different backgrounds, beliefs can be misunderstood, and how it is important for organizations, especially in law enforcement, me being a former law enforcement officer, to have cultural awareness, accountability, but most of all, stand up for what's right, stand up for the truth, stand up for what's going on around you, speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. And these are factors that are embedded in our Muslim faith, standing up for what's right. But even for human morality is, I mean, you see what's going on around you in the world. And a lot of what you see in our government is being silenced. It's not being talked about, and it's kind of being hushed. And that's where I kind of have to sit there and say, look, if they're not going to do it, I'm going to do it. I'm going to speak up about what's right. I'm going to stand for what's right. I'm going to fight for my name. I'm going to fight for my people's name. And that's really what it really comes down to is I learned a lot from this and I'm continuously growing from this. And I just say that to everybody listening, everybody watching, don't forget who you are. Don't forget where you come from. It is important to know who you are as a person.
I love that. I honestly couldn't have said it any better. I wanted to sit down and honestly like thank you for coming on. I'm so humbled to have you on. And the reason I say that is I come from a very big activist background. I come from a political organizing background. I come from a journalism and podcasting background. And obviously, on this end of the spectrum, when it comes to politics, there are very heavy, I guess you can say, anti police, anti law enforcement sentiments. And so, even doing this interview, I think was not just a very stigmatized thing for you, but also for me. And I think for us to be able to be on opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to certain occupations and to understand each other on like a human level and realize, look, we both want the same thing. We're both trying to advocate for our community. We're trying to get Muslim representation. We want to make sure that our people are not being marginalized out there, whether it's in journalism or law enforcement. I think a lot of people they'll see like Muslims in government, they'll see Muslims in law enforcement, they'll see not just Muslims, but minorities in general. And the first thing you hear is, oh, they're sellouts and they're doing X, Y, and Z. But you're coming from a very different perspective where you're like, I did it for advocacy. And you stood on that to the point where you went through harassment, you're discriminated against, you're written up, repeatedly. You were in like such an uncomfortable environment and you stood on that. You ended up losing your livelihood as a byproduct of it. But that's how much faith meant to you. That's how much advocating for the Palestinian and Arab community, the Muslim community at large, minorities overall, that's how important it was for you. If there's anyone who can, understand that, it's well, not just me, but people from my end of the spectrum, the activists, the protesters, the journalists, the geopolitical analysts,
Right,
the
right.
podcasters. A lot of what human beings want has not it doesn't have to do with the occupation or the title we hold. It's the morals and like ethics we have. And so I
Mhm.
brought you on not because I'm advocating for law enforcement. I think you and I have very different opinions on that, but to hear your story, to understand the journey, to kind of hear your perspective from it, it kind of made me, and I'm sure a multitude of other people realize, in the audience, that we're all advocating for the same thing. We're all being discriminated against in very similar ways. So I'm humbled, to have you on my podcast. I'm humbled to sit down with you and to hear your story. I hope we can kind of keep in touch with you and see what happens. And inshallah, next time you come on, you have great news for us. You have a different
Inshallah.
job, whatever the case may be. We're praying for your grandmother, your family. And I'm sure just as I've been moved by this interview, there's a multitude of other people that are watching. They may want to help you out personally. Maybe they want to reach out to you and say, hey, you really inspired me. They may want to collaborate with you. Maybe they want to donate, in case you have a GoFundMe or anything of that nature. Or maybe they just want to follow you on social media and see what you're up to. Are you able to share ways to contact you and ways that people can help you by any chance?
Absolutely. So I have a multitude of social media platforms. So the first one is Instagram, OFC ADM, which is Officer Adam, my name, Adam. So that's my Instagram name and my Instagram username. On Twitter, it's AD, the number 8, AW. And,
And Twitter's now known as X, everyone. So,
or X, sorry,
yeah.
X.
Sorry.
And
Thanks to Elon.
yeah, thanks, Elon. And another is my email, Adam Awwad, ADAMAWWAD 56 at gmail.com. Those are just a couple ways to reach out to me. And I have set up a GoFundMe, and it's going to be put in the description of this video. I do hope that, people see it, people hear my story, and we just go from there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to put all the information that he just shared down in the description. Obviously, if you guys have any questions, please reach out to me personally or him as well. And remember, he does have a GoFundMe. He is incurring a lot of legal costs and living expenses granted to circumstances. So we always advocate that if you're able to help, please, help Palestinians in Gaza first. But if you have anything beyond that, please look at the Palestinians that are suffering on a domestic level. And granted, everything that he's been through, if you do have the funds, if you do have, the money or anything of that nature, or if you have resources that could potentially help him, please reach out to myself or him. Of course, I'm Heena Lotus. This is actually my first podcast episode on my own. I know you guys have followed me on a multitude of different networks. You guys can also reach out to me on Twitter or X. I'm going to spell how to, contact me. It's going to be Interepidlotus. I'm also on TikTok. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook at Heena Lotus. And then if you would like to collaborate or would love to be on the podcast, have any questions or concerns, please reach out to me at Heena Lotus media@gmail.com. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. It's been such a pleasure interviewing you, Adam, and hopefully we get to, get some great news soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I thank you, and I thank your platform, and it's been honestly an honor. And I thank Marcus, and I thank every single one of you that is watching.
Thank you so much, everyone. Salam, and have a great night.
Assalamu alaikum.